All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of Course of Action. I have an awesome guest today. Alex Aaronson is on here, and he's joining us as a Navy vet, went to law school, and has several really, really cool books out. So let's welcome him in. Alex, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, man. It's been a beautiful day here in DFW, Texas, and I just live a charmed life right now. So waiting for everything to go to hell.
Right. I've been sick lately, and I get this head cold that seems like every spring, and
hmm
it just kills me. And then I always have, you know, a lot of things like this to do around that time, and it just never hits perfect timing. It seems like that kind of
Right.
hell just breaks loose for me, and I'm like, ugh. So I got cough drops, I got Gatorade right here, I got my mute button ready. So I'm gonna kind of let you lead a lot of it. That way I don't, go into a coughing fit and have to edit half this out. So
Well, my wife says I do love the sound of my own voice, so I think I can hold up my end.
hey, this is perfect then. So let's talk about you a little bit, man, before we get into the books.
Okay.
A Navy vet. When did you go into the Navy?
I actually went in 1990. I actually signed the papers in '91, but this was after the Gulf War. There was kind of a long wait, so I was in delayed entry or deferred entry for a good while. So I didn't actually go to boot camp until February of '92, and that was really interesting. I think, and I mentioned this in some of our previous conversation or our correspondence, but
Hmm.
I I pretty much think that I won the Cold War single handedly, and so hear me out. I signed the papers in the sort of the spring of '91, and
Okay.
then the Soviets were like, "We cuss on here or no?"
Sure.
Okay, the Soviets are like, "Oh shit, it's Alex. We got to get out of here." So they had the coup, and then they collapsed, and so by the time I actually got to language school, because I joined as a Russian translator, I had guaranteed
Oh,
language.
okay. Okay,
Right.
I'm following you now. So they're like, yeah, we don't want none of this the Alex guy.
Yeah, we don't want none of Alex, so that's why they quit. Now Reagan takes the credit, and I let him have it, but I'm pretty sure it was me.
I love that. And so you went in language with Russian, and then how long did you stay in?
Yeah, well, I did 5 years. They really got a lot of us linguists because if you signed a 1 year extension, they'd give you, some crummy bonus that is nothing compared to the bonuses during the war and everything. But so I think I got like $5,000 to take an extra year. But I did my 5 years active and then three in the reserves to round out the eight, and then pretty much called it a day because being a Russian translator from 1992 to 1997, 1990, even 2000, not very interesting job.
Yeah.
Um, they, when I joined, there was a Soviet Union. By the time I got done with training, there was hardly anything. I mean, they didn't have enough money to pay their people. The
Hmm.
ships would just rust to the pier. I mean, that was the joke, was that they would, and it's not a joke, it's real. They
Yeah.
would they would only paint the seaside of their ships. They would only maintain the seaside so that somebody looking at them from outside would see what looked like a fairly well taken care of ship. But if you're looking at it from the port side, it's just rusting to the pier. So it
Yeah.
was it was a real boring time to be a Russian translator. And the worst part were all the old vets, all the salty dogs that were out there telling you about how great it was back when the Russians were a real threat and they'd come to play, and they're like, we're excited because there's a transport plane flying across Siberia. Woo! It's exciting. So
So
yeah,
what do you think of this Russia Ukraine thing now, man? Because it's been going on for over a year now.
right.
Lots of rumors on Russia's real strength and what they're really capable
Mhm.
of. Do you think this is the truth of Russia's military might, or are they kind of sandbagging a little?
I think, and I don't want to pat myself too hard on the back, and so I'll post my loss first. I think I said 3 months at the beginning. In fact, the first videos that I ever made were basically explaining to my readers what my take on Russia was, and
Hmm.
with regard to Ukraine. And so I did think it would take about 3 months, and I still think that without Western support, especially the javelins, that could have really, that could have still happened. But I did not foresee the amount of support and the rapidity of our support, and I think that has really, really kept the Ukrainians in the fight. But while I did get that wrong, I did say, and this is actually me posting another L, but for the right reason. And if Putin had listened to me, maybe anyway, I
Right.
said that this was before the invasion. I said that I only saw them coming in through the east, and not coming in from Belarus or from the north, mostly because they were afraid of tripping over their own dicks.
Right.
And actually that was the line. It was never underestimate the Red Army's ability to trip over its own dick. And
Hmm.
and so keeping them where they had a possibly, well, not possibly, but definitely a more sympathetic populace in the east, that should have been a no-brainer. I understand that they thought they might be able to decapitate Kiev in a heartbeat, and when that didn't happen, now they're all the way back to what they would have started, with. So, um, and yeah, I get into a little bit of trouble with folks, especially on the internets, because I feel like I have a better understanding about Russia's motivations, how Russia sees this. I'm not suggesting that it justifies an invasion. I'm not suggesting that it justifies a war. Um, and I'm going to slowly back out of that conversation, just to say there was a lot of shady shit going on in
Oh yeah.
Ukraine,
Oh yeah.
going all the way back to 2014. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let's not forget. I mean, the difference between Poland and Ukraine is that Ukraine has been corrupt and will never not be corrupt. Same with Russia. These are just these kleptocracies that are, they seem incapable of putting together the rule of law
Yeah.
and
Sticking
protecting
to it.
their citizens. Right.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, so for example, the Ukraine finally gets their first election where they actually, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe comes in and blesses it, says, "Hey, good job, you guys had a democratic election." They deposed him, and that's where we are now. And they deposed him, fairly, or there was going to be another election fairly soon after that, and so they could have let that go to a vote, but I think they
Yeah.
knew that it wasn't going to go their way.
Hmm.
um, so yeah, and Poland, on the other hand, I get that some people have think that Poland has a nationalism problem. I think that Poland is just Poland, and they've got their stuff together, unlike a lot of Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I have to agree. I think at one point I kind of felt like Russia was sandbagging it a little, seeing what they could kind of milk out of this, seeing if anybody came to the table, to kind of join their side. And the more and more I thought about it, the more and more I was like, well, they probably aren't, because they have a lot at risk if they put all their forces, over on the Ukraine border,
right,
because they've always been really worried about the United States coming across the ocean over on their eastern side, our
right,
western side,
hmm,
over there by Alaska. And they fly dangerously over there, as we've seen in the news,
right.
recently. Um, so you used to think, they're sandbagging it because they just don't want to. They want to wait and see who's coming on their side. But like I said, the more and more I thought about it, the more and more I was like, no, they can't afford to. They got what they have. They're fighting in Ukraine because they cannot shift forces. They probably could, because there's not like a huge risk of the United States like invading. Why would we invade Eastern Russia? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I could see why they'd be nervous about that. And they'd say,
They historically have a lot of trouble with China on their border too. So I know that they just got done playing nicey nicey, but
is that for the
that,
cameras? Is that lip service
well,
or?
I mean, it's just of convenience.
Yeah,
Interestingly enough, I my first writing experience was with James Razone, and I hopped in and helped him with a series that was already in progress. It was called the Monroe Doctrine, and
yeah,
in
great
volume
book.
4, he actually had me write a Chinese invasion of Russia in 2024. And
Next year.
right, yeah, it's coming up.
Let's see. Let's see if you got that prediction correct.
Well,
If
I
times
definitely.
have chosen us or shown us anything about you, is that it's oddly convenient.
That's right. I I did actually do pretty well, I think, in Russian underperformance. I mean, the Russians get their asses kicked all the way, across Siberia and the Primorsky Krai, the that that area from like uh, oh my goodness, Khabarovsk all the way down to Vladivostok. They almost pushed them, right off their own island. And if it wasn't for last minute heroic you know reinforcements, they definitely would have lost. So, but yeah, there was not a single Russian victory in that book until like the very end of that side of the fighting.
So during your time um, as a linguist, did you have any like tense or scary moments being a Russian translator?
Oh my gosh. Again, when I was in, it was that the scariest part was when I got super drunk in Japan one time and ended up in the emergency room getting 12 stitches on this hand because some idiot friends of mine and I decided we wanted to be blood brothers.
Oh wow.
So barracks shenanigans were the only really scary thing that I had to deal with. And then, if there had been anything scary, it would probably be still be classified. So um, there isn't anything. I'm not trying to be coy here, but
No, I understand. So 8 years in, and what led to the decision to go to law school?
okay. So um, when I first got out of the Navy, I mean, I barely graduated high school. I didn't know I was graduating until the graduation rehearsal, the day before graduation, when Coach Bell gave me a thumbs up to let me know that he lied and told them I passed basic algebra or something. Um, and so when I got out of the Navy, and if the Soviet Union had been out there and it had been hopping and it had been just something exciting going on, I probably would have stuck it out. But I wasn't going to read. I was going to cross train. I certainly didn't want another language because until the last couple of years with the Chinese naval buildup, there was no naval threat. You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
so so yeah, I just wasn't going to work out. So I decided, well, I'm going to go to college, but I'm kind of a knucklehead, so we'll see how it goes. And it turned out that when I was in high school, and tell me if it was like this for you, but every once in a while, and by once in a while I mean all the time, the teachers would be like, "Oh, hey, and here's something that you need to do at home, and so take care of that, and then get back to us tomorrow." And I'd never do homework. Are you kidding? What are you talking about? So that
Yeah.
kind of explains why I got terrible grades. And it turned out, so essentially I just needed some more time in the oven, really. And the Navy gave me that. So when I got out, you figure, okay, now I'm going to college. It's on my own dime. I've got the GI Bill, but that this is, I'm paying for this. So I had a much different attitude, and I started paying attention. And my math teacher, I went to a junior college in California, and my math teacher was a bombardier navigator for A6 intruders. And I just idolized the guy, and I was like, I can't let him down. And so I really buckled down, and I was like, oh my god, if I actually try, I'm not bad at this stuff. So that was a real epiphany for me. And I guess I should point out it might be a little weird. I had a teacher who was a bombardier navigator. I went to a school called Saracoso Community College in the California desert. It's actually adjacent to the China Lake Naval Weapons Center, or
Hmm.
Naval Air Weapons Station, whatever they call it now. So we had a lot of those types, and the spouses of physicists that work on the base and things like that. So really a really good educational staff for a really in a really weird location. But I did well in that, and so I was a 4.0 student all the way through the junior college. I transferred to the University of California at Riverside, and I was a 4.0 student there. I graduated top of my class in political science, and I was stoked because uh, my ex-wife was my wife at the time was working for the NSA in Laurel, Maryland, at Fort Meade, and my dean was transferring. He was taking over the program, the political science program, over at the University of Maryland.
Mm.
Okay, wow, perfect. So I was all set to get my PhD in international relations. They had this great program there. Just go straight through. Don't do your master's and then your PhD. Just do it all together. All at once.
Okay.
It
Nice.
was Yeah, it was really cool. And I was gonna take a gap year, just to work, and I I definitely overestimated my ability to get a gig in DC. Um, that was a little eye opening. But when then yeah, so I'm studying for the GRE and I'm pretty excited. And then all of a sudden, these assholes fly these airplanes into the World Trade Center, and
Yeah.
and I'm like, shit, I don't know anything about international relations. If I couldn't see something like this coming, and I actually, this is what makes me really annoyed. I sometimes think that God was looking out for me, because at the time I thought, oh my God, my thesis is ruined. It's ruined, I tell you, because I had already had a thesis picked out. I had already done a lot of the research on it, just getting the presentation put together. And so I decided that my thesis was ruined by September 11th, because for reasons. And instead, it turns out that no, it just delayed its importance by about 20 years. So now we're looking at things. I'm looking at things, and I'm like, oh my God, I sure wish somebody had studied this in post grad school,
Right.
because the idea was to understand how we transition. You know what? I don't want to turn this thing into a show about my dissertation. I never did. So,
No, it's
um,
fine. Go ahead. I'd like to hear about it.
well, the idea was basically that, and this is all, and I'm going to lose people here. This is based on a Marxist concept of social structures of accumulation. And this is an economic theory that says basically that economies, they ride waves of boom, and then they hit these busts that are typically shorter. And here's why: because they create institutions which they call social structures of accumulation, that are favorable for generating wealth. But then over time, those institutions break down over their own internal contradictions. And when that happens, they no longer work to produce growth, and that's when you hit a recession. That's when you get a stagnation or something. And the only way out of that is to come up with new reasons why.
Hmm.
And or new reasons how to new structures of accumulation. So the best example, or the quickest example, I think, for most people, is uh, the stagflation of the 70s and the early 80s. That was where inflation was absolutely rampant, and we just had no growth, and we had inflation, which meant the economy is shrinking. uh, the way that they finally managed to get a hold of this, and this was Paul Volcker, and interestingly enough, I found this out in my. I always thought this was under Reagan, but Volcker actually started it under Jimmy Carter.
Mm.
So that actually gets a mention in my first book. But the way they managed that was by jacking up the prime interest rate, which then reduced everybody's access to money. So everybody still had the same amount of money that they had. They just couldn't get big loans for big projects. Now, this causes an economic slowdown, which causes increased unemployment. So there are bad sides to it. But
Sure.
that was the only way they could create, a fundamental ability um, to get the economy going again. Well, that breaks down over its own internal contradictions in two ways. Firstly, we started around 2000 when we were getting to like 0%, 0.01% or whatever it was on the prime rate. So you can't go any lower than that. So you can't speed the economy up, and all you can do is use it as a brake. But then now everybody knows what's going to happen, and so as soon as and we're seeing it play out right now, where people are just going losing their minds when the interest rate goes up, because they know that a recession is going to follow, or at least generally speaking, that's
Yeah.
going to be what happens.
Historically, that's
Unemployment
kind
is
of
going
what
to
we've
go
seen.
up,
Yeah.
and no president wants that. It worked the last time because nobody could say, oh, this is what's coming. And so that's kind of an example. So another one, just one more example. The Japanese economy after World War II, devastated. Absolutely, yeah, we gave them a little bit of rebuilding to do. And one of the ways that they were able to instill confidence in their political and economic system was to offer young people lifetime employment. And this turned out to be a great way to motivate the workforce. Problem is, over time, it's going to break down because you ended up with the middle management. Not everybody can keep climbing, and so you ended up with people that didn't have jobs but still had paychecks,
Oh
and
wow.
they had jobs. So, sitting in an office, staring at a briefcase, and but they couldn't be fired. So
Mm.
that's another example of how, okay, it was good, and then it breaks down, and now you need something new. And I was taking that concept and applying it to international relations to say that we build structures of security, international structures of security. For example, at the end of the Second World War, we decided to start a couple of things. The new bipolar alliance system, where you had the Warsaw Pact and NATO and the United Nations. Now, I remember when the United Nations had relevancy. And I remember when NATO and the Warsaw Pact were keeping the peace by keeping everybody, aware that any war would be a losing effort. And it turned out that, in my opinion, the United Nations' best use was really as a communicative tool between the superpowers. Because of the way it was structured with the Security Council and the veto, no meaningful resolution was going to get passed after the start of the Korean War. When China and Russia didn't, they just kind of let it go by after they realized, that was kind of dumb. That was never going to happen again. So, real, strong enforcement was never going to happen from the United Nations. So,
Mm.
as soon as there wasn't a Soviet Union and a United States or a NATO and a Warsaw Pact to talk and communicate, it just turned into the everybody hate on America club. And that's kind of where I feel it is now. Um,
Yeah.
when and I don't want to get too political because I am I'm the guy that just makes everybody mad. So I knew when I wrote Advanced to Contact, I knew that this was going to happen, and it still blows my mind. I said, I'm I am not a fan of Jimmy Carter. I think he was not a good president. And I think that his attempts to negotiate a peace, actually his settlement with North Korea before they had the bomb, was one of the dumbest pieces of foreign policy of my lifetime. It's been eclipsed since then, but
Wow.
um, at the time, and, so I'm no fan of Jimmy Carter, but I knew that people were going to read this book and they were going to say, "Wow, this guy loves Jimmy Carter. He's Jimmy Carter's biggest fan. What a fake story." And I was going to get 1-star reviews that pointed the finger at my treatment of Jimmy Carter, and I will be damned. But I've got at least 4 or 5 of them right now. Right now, if you go to Advanced to Contact and you look at the reviews and you go to most recent, because I'm obsessive, yes, it is a 1-star review that says it's science fiction and that aliens have replaced Jimmy Carter and his administration with aliens who act completely different. And the worst part is that he started the review out so complimentary too. I was like, "This is a well thought out and engaged story of and then it just went downhill from there."
Is
But
this on Amazon?
yeah, yeah, on Amazon, that's an Amazon review, right?
I gotta look it up.
So but to get back to the structures of international structures of security, the UN's useless now, and this is another one that gets me in trouble is that I really think that NATO should have been dissolved in '92, and we should have entered into new agreements that were reflective of the world as it was evolving. I think that NATO right now has become way too large. It is, and this is why. It's not because I don't want to protect Poland. I mean, if you haven't figured out yet, Poland is kind of my favorite country.
Hmm.
It's where my people are from, so big fan. Um, but it's not that I don't think Poland deserved to be part of a security alliance. It's just not. It shouldn't be part of NATO, and here's why: NATO is a consensus body. It cannot take action unless it has unanimous consent. So the bigger it gets, the more people you have to get on board. you already have Greece and Turkey, for crying out loud, trying to agree on something. So
Yeah.
now when we add the Baltic states and Poland, it's just it. And why? Why couldn't it have been something else? Why did it have to be NATO?
Yeah.
That's what I want to understand.
Okay,
And
so I got this review up, and we have to talk about it because it's hilarious. Um, and I also bring it up because I was tweeting with Don Bentley the other day on Twitter, and he made a mention of people reading into fiction books and assuming that the way politics or administration or some kind of foreign policy that's written inside that book is a real depiction of the author's opinions.
right,
And they forget that it's fiction. And
right.
fiction is a story. It's a storyline that's made up. Like it's not fact. Um, but
Actually, hold on. Let's get the spoiler. Let's get the spoiler out first, okay?
okay.
Because I don't think this is too big of a spoiler. If this is going to ruin the book for you, I want you to know about it ahead of time. And that is, in this alternate history, due to factors that I feel I lay out pretty well, Jimmy Carter wins the 1980 election. So that's what's got a bunch of people really upset at me.
Oh yeah, this guy, this is awesome. He starts it off wonderful, like you said. I found this book thoughtful and intelligent, like all your military alternate histories, but this story was ruined by your depiction of Jimmy Carter. And again, fiction, guys, fiction, guys.
And like I said, I'm not a Carter fan. I say I have a little more respect for him now than I did when I started researching the book, but still not a fan.
it's the last It's the last paragraph that gets me.
Mm-hmm.
He
Yep.
says, now, as science fiction, what if Soviet endgame crisis and aliens replaced Jimmy Carter and his administration with completely different people but pretending to be them? That's the story you wrote.
Right.
Such a
Like,
pointed, like he points the finger right at and you say, that's what you did, Alex.
yep. It's like, oh yeah, I'm sure you're the official biographer of Zbigniew Brzezinski or Gene Kirkpatrick. You know, I'm sure you're the expert on this one, guy.
You know
But you
what
know what?
though? It's funny that people feel so passionately that they say, okay, I gotta come on to Amazon and really tell this guy something. I'm gonna give him a 1-star review and tell him that you changed history with this. It's fiction.
I had one
Relax.
that was like this guy said I wasn't prepared for a world where Jimmy Carter wins the 1980 election. I don't like when people change history. It's like, bro, you bought an alternate history book.
You bought a fiction book. There's gonna be
Right,
things in
right.
it that are not real. That's
That's right.
fiction. Like so.
Well, and I actually predicted a similar backlash because in the second book, George W. Bush is a POV character, and I expected to get some brushback on that, but I haven't so far. So
Yeah,
that's been
maybe
nice.
maybe people finally got the point and said, okay, we get what
Right,
this guy's laying down, and it's supposed to be different.
right,
It's
right.
he's not telling the truth. This is not his
Yeah,
opinion. It's a
not a history
story.
book.
I'm
Right,
following it now. Like like you can look at the categories on Amazon, guys. If it doesn't say historical fiction,
right. That's right.
so let's get into the books. But first, let's talk about how you got into writing. How did that happen? Did you have an epiphany? Did you always want to write? How did that work?
Well, I've always wanted to write, but going back to what I said earlier about me being, practically functionally illiterate when I graduated high school, I had to teach myself grammar when I was in the Navy because I could talk like nobody's business, but I couldn't write for shit. And I'm left-handed, and I went to DoD schools, and they tried to make me right-handed, and I think that really gave me some serious developmental delays, and it never worked. I'm still left-handed. Um, so so I always liked to write, but I couldn't do it well enough to present it to anybody or to kind of to do anything with it. And so when I never really did much of it. I wrote a couple of short stories and some really bad poems when I was in like high school and in the Navy. But it was learning how to write uh, term papers basically gave me the confidence to say, okay, well, I can do this fantastically. Again, top of my class. So I'm surely I can write fiction, right? It turns out, no, I could not. But I tried, and I have several aborted attempts to get started, but it wasn't until I got on the wagon a couple of years ago, and I needed something to kind of focus on. And I was thinking about my favorite movie is the Philadelphia Story with Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, and he talks about how when he quit drinking, he was reading a lot. He's reading a lot of things, and I thought, well, what if I try to write? You know, you had that idea for that Operation Eagle Claw short story. Why don't you do that? If you can write 30,000 words on Eagle Claw, maybe you can do something.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. I mean, the first thing I did was I hit the internet and said, all right, how the hell do dialogue tags work? Because
Hmm.
that is confusing to me. The one thing that I didn't get until I got into editing was head hopping. I was all over the place with my points of view. So that was the biggest challenge I had. Well, second biggest challenge. We'll talk about the biggest challenge in a minute. Um, but I decided that yeah, okay, I can do this. I got with my a couple of my Marine buddies because actually that's funny. I was in the Navy, but I spent most of my time on an Air Force base stationed with a Marine unit.
Wow.
So yeah, Company E was the radio battalion detachment that was up in Misawa with me, and
Okay.
so we were grouped by as the sea services, and so the Air Force was over here, and we were over here. So they called me Doc and get me drunk. So it was a good time. It was very very well played. Um, but I got with some of my Marine buddies, and I'm like, look, I'm inserting a Marine unit into Eagle Claw that was never there, but now let's talk. How is this going to work? How would they do this? How would they do that? And it was great because it gave us kind of a connection point that we hadn't had in a long time. It gave us something to talk about. It gave us something to get together over. So that was really nice to get that camaraderie back. And and so yeah, I got those 30,000 words down, and that's when I started reaching out to some authors. And I'm like, okay, I'm looking for veterans that are publishing, and so I reach out to a couple of them, and I got some good advice. But the one that took the most interest in me was James Razone, and he said, "Hey, look, I got some things going on, but I like what you're doing, and let's talk about that. But I can't do anything right now." I'm like, "Well, I'm not doing anything. I'm working in my IT job." It's funny. We didn't even get to law school, did we? I went to law school because I wasn't getting my PhD anymore. I decided I just gonna go make bags of money, which turns out that didn't work out quite the way I wanted either. But what are you gonna do? I'm not complaining. Did not like being a lawyer very much. Anyway, so yeah, I reached out to James, and he says, "Look, we can do something." He wanted to work on a different series, so it wasn't going to be Soviet Endgame. He wanted to do a series that was in the '80s and a war with the United States and China against the Soviet Union. And so I actually did start that. I started working on that. I was probably about 20,000 words in, and I actually really had a lot of fun writing that one. But then one of his other writing partners, I forget Sam's last name. He actually got reactivated and sent overseas, and so he was out. He was supposed to be writing Monroe Doctrine, and so when he got called up, they brought me up from the minors. So like, all right, Aaronson, let's see what you can do, and so yeah, that's where I got that start. So all these ideas that I had now, they're still just rattling around in my head, and a couple of them I think are kind of going to turn into something in the future. So all that work that I did in the past isn't really going to be thrown away. It's just going to be recycled into new stories in the future. Um, but yeah, it really seemed to take off. So
So how'd you settle on the first book here, and really get into Advance to Contact and kind of get kicked off of that?
I love alternate history, and I love and this is funny, hardware, military hardware. I'm just such a geek about it. And so Advanced to Contact, the the germ was an interview with Jimmy Carter, where they said he was on a talk show, and they said, or an interview, and they said, "What would you do differently?" And he said, "Well, I would have sent another helicopter." And what he's alluding to is that they had 8 helicopters. They needed 6 to get the operation to conduct the operation. When they lost 3, they basically called it and aborted. And so he was just saying, well, just one more helicopter would have done it. And I remembered thinking, that mission was super convoluted, pal. I don't know that another helicopter was going to be sufficient.
Yeah.
Um, and so that got me thinking about, okay, well, what could we do with Eagle Claw? What would that have looked like if it had been successful? My friend Colin Salt he points out in his review of the book he does the Fold Apocalypse blog, and he's like, all right, look, this is just like oh gosh, Sea Lion, Operation Sea Lion in World War II, the German invasion of the United
Mm-hmm.
Kingdom. He's like, it's a terrible point of departure because it never would have worked. And so he says the same thing about Eagle Claw. And I don't think he's wrong. I think that it was definitely overcomplicated. I think I do a decent job of defending it in the book, but so yeah, I think that Eagle Claw was probably doomed to failure, but that didn't mean I couldn't write about it working. And so that's kind of
Yeah.
where it started. And I thought, okay, well, what are going to be the repercussions of that? What are the downstream effects? First of all, that's going to give Jimmy Carter a political boost going into the spring of 1980. So while the Republicans are figuring out who their candidate is, he's got a boost. Edward Kennedy's going to drop out and endorse him, and that's going to really solidify the Democratic ticket.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, okay, well, that would be interesting, and with that increased patriotism, and as part of this, the Shah doesn't actually fully establish control over Iran, so there is no 1979 oil crisis, and so it just a lot of positive factors. So what does that mean? Okay, now the Americans have their ally in Iran is still firmly intact. How do the Russians respond to this? They have to know that they have the technological superiority or parity for the first time ever in most of the battlefield areas. So as far as tanks go, we're talking about T-72s. I know they got a bad rap now, but we're talking 40 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the M1 Abrams wasn't even deployed to Europe at the time. The First Armored Division was still fitting out with those when the war breaks out. So it's T-72s versus M60A3s. So it's parity at least, and sometimes it's superiority. We don't have the Bradley fighting vehicle. It's still M113s. Just little death boxes running around out there, and they're rolling in with BMPs with 73 millimeter cannons mounted on the front of them.
Yep.
So yeah, if the Soviets wanted to take advantage of this, how would they do it? And so that's really kind of the genesis of the story.
So then, how did fire and maneuver kind of come in?
And mild spoiler, the first book ends with Misha, one of the VDV paratroopers, riding a transport or riding an IL-76 into Germany, at the kickoff of a Third World War. So fire and maneuver is essentially the first 6 months of World War III. And what
Okay.
does that look like? And it's the first book deals a lot with the Middle East and South America. Essentially, the idea here is that the Soviets decided that one of the things that they would need to do in order to make this work is to pull our rapid deployment forces off sides, to put them in a position where they couldn't redeploy easily. So they manufactured crises in Nicaragua and in Iran. So basically, in this history, the Iran-Iraq War happens at the behest of the Soviets. They basically are working with Saddam and planning with Saddam to fight the war against Iran. So that kicks off in 1980. The Sandinistas pick a fight with the U.S., which is absurd, but it's what the Russians are basically setting this up. The Nicaraguans have no idea that, in fact, they're told after the fact the Russian general is briefing Daniel Ortega, the leader of the Sandinistas, and Ortega's like, "Wait, let me understand something. You guys just sank a U.S. amphibious group," and the general's like, "No, Senor, you sank a U.S. amphibious." And so they manufacture these conflicts to get the 101st Airborne deployed to Nicaragua. The 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions are going to Nicaragua, and the 82nd Airborne is sent to Iran as sort of a peacekeeping force to try and to get that calmed down. In fact, and the Russians end up sending in a naval infantry brigade as well, uh, again as peacekeepers, because they're playing nice, they're saying all the right diplomatic things,
Sure.
um, while they get ready to invade. So I think uh, it's hopefully clever.
So, what is in the future for writing? Do you got another project going on? We're gonna
Yeah,
talk World War IV, or what's going on now?
that's a tough question because I got three more of this series to get us to the end of World War III, and then there are two things I'm working on, and it is a battle of my heart and my mind, and the so my brain tells me that the next book is the one that I really will have a lot of fun with, but it's the one that will be more likely to be a success and less risky. How's that? And that is, you're exactly right. Skip to the 2000s, same universe. What does it look like? And and I'm really excited about that because alternate history is more fun the further you get from the point of departure.
Hmm.
And so, like for example, and I told you at the beginning I was a hardware geek. Um, in the third book of this series, we get to see one of my favorite planes that never was, and that is the F-20 Tiger Shark. Basically, Northrop wanted to take the F-5 and improve the avionics, give it Sparrow missiles and AMRAAMs when those finally come out, and fly by wire, and they were just tricking this thing out. But essentially, the government said, "No, we got the F-16, we're good." And everybody else in the world said, "We're also going to go with the F-16 because it's a new platform. It's got plenty of room for development." Whereas the F-20 is pretty much the end of that airframe. You can't make it any better
Hmm.
at that point. And I think that was the right call in our timeline. But in the Soviet Endgame timeline, a lot of our allies are flying the F-5s. They need to, replacements for the ones that are getting shot down and shot up. They need improved capabilities, and the F-20 was re-engined with the F-404 engines from the F-18 Hornets. So in the story, because they needed to keep the Northrop factory creating F-5s, they went ahead and just added the development first in the form of what was called the F5G, and that was the F5 with a new radar that allowed it to fire Sparrow missiles. And then the second phase of that is the F20 when they re-engine it and get the fly-by-wire and everything. And these are going to get pushed out of that factory in Burbank. But the downstream effect of that is that now they can't convert that factory to build Hornets, and
Mm.
so they have a very limited number of F-18s. Plus, those engines that were going to the F-18s are now going to the F-20s. So the F-18 essentially gets kind of priced out of the marketplace. It's produced in small numbers, and they're going to turn it over to the Marines. It'll never make it to the carriers. It's,
Interesting.
it's just going to be a air combat air support plane for the Marine Corps. So
That's
so
an
yeah,
interesting
and
take on that because the F-18 really turned into the Navy's workhorse
right,
after the
yeah, right.
Tomcat left. So that's an
Yep.
interesting take on that.
So imagine a world, and spoiler alerts, there is still a Soviet Union in the 2020s. So we don't have a peace dividend. We don't have backing down.
Hmm.
What weapon systems are we going to see? You know, so for example, I think a lot of people would suggest that the F-22 won its fly off against the F-23 based in part on it being more practical right now, even though technically the F-23 had better performance in a lot of areas. Well, if you still have an existential threat, do you make that choice, or do you put all your money into the F-23 to make it the best fighter that you can possibly get? Um, there's one aircraft that's it's the, oh gosh, what is it? The FV-12, and it I don't think that it physically ever would have been successful, but damn it, it's my story, so I'm going to make it successful. And that was a vertical launch fighter. So like the AV-8B was supposed to be a combat air support and attack plane. It was never really meant to be a fighter
Okay.
so much, but this was supposed to be its fighter complement. And then the sea control ship was an idea that came out in the 70s. The idea was kind of like in World War II when they built the Jeep carriers, the smaller carriers. That was what this was with the vertical takeoff planes, and it was smaller. And so I think of did you know that India has two aircraft carriers, one operational?
I think I've heard that.
The aircraft carrier that they have that is operational is actually a converted Soviet shitbox. It's one of the Kievs, but they built a sloped ramp on the front of that thing, and they're launching MiGs off of it. And so it's no longer a VTOL carrier, but it's small. It's very much kind of like what a sea control ship would have been.
Hmm.
Um, so that's something that I want to see, and just kind of rolling out some of the new hardware, following up on some of the stories. I got some really good storylines, I think, of course, going forward. But that's the brain. That's the brain saying, if this series is successful, you should keep going with the successful.
Yeah,
But
sure. Why not? I mean, why not? I mean, there's Lord knows in the 2000s there was the 2000s, the 2010s, and going into the 2020s. There's plenty of storyline to take from. You know,
right,
um, what if things went different in Crimea? What if there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot you could really go off of, and it's really cool to think about it. So I love the idea of kind of doing that alternate history and seeing, what if this didn't go accordingly,
right.
because you can do a lot with that. And some of it, yeah, might feel like a bit of a stretch, and then others might go, whoa, you know, we could have been
Yeah,
deadly close to that happening.
yeah, you really can't please everybody when it comes to things like that. And actually, it's funny
That's
because
okay.
I got dinged on that once, and I don't mind, but it was basically this person says, I read a lot of alternate history, and I want a very purely defined point of departure. And I'm like, oh, that's just not me. I don't like to get it that granular. So, the point of departure here was that and most people can't tell me what the point of departure is, and I'm fine with that. But it was when the Shah did not flee Iran. That's actually what started the change in everything. So that's what led the Ayatollah to not be able to take over the whole thing. But I didn't spell it out. I didn't spoon feed it to anybody, and I just, yeah, I don't think it's that important. But
Again, people, it's fiction. So,
right, right,
you know, uh, don't tell me that it's too far fetched or anything like that. You've watched
right,
movies about aliens invading the United
right,
States and blowing up the White House and other things much further than the truth than that. So don't get mad at an
exactly.
author because they've done an alternate history or they've kind of changed things around in their storyline. Like people need to
Well,
quit taking it so seriously.
and I try very hard, and I think I do a very good job, if I do say so myself, of grounding it in reality. If I make a change, I explain it. The reason that Reagan lost had a lot, not just a lot to do with how Carter was acting and what was happening in the world, but how the Republican primary played out. I went into a lot of detail about the Republican primary. In fact, this drove me crazy. I was so mad when this happened. Um, I had already written this. I had already written this, and okay, so John Connolly, he was the governor of Texas when Kennedy got shot. He was a Democrat at that time, but he switched to be a Republican in the 70s, and he ran as a Republican in 1980. And he put all of his money, all of his eggs in one basket: South Carolina. He thought Dixie is going to come and vote for me, and that will spark my campaign, and then it's off to the races. And it didn't work in our timeline. In our timeline, it didn't work at all. He got like one elector, and he was basically dead from that time on. But
Didn't
I was
work.
like, what if it did? What if it worked, man? And so I ran with that, and then it turned into he and Reagan have this contentious primary where he's winning all of the South and Reagan's winning everywhere else. And when California puts their votes in, Reagan wins. But it was a lot of money spent. Reagan couldn't refocus his campaign against Carter because he still had to deal with Connolly. Okay, I thought that was just great writing, man, and it's kind of believable, right? Well, it's
Sure.
definitely believable because that's exactly what Joe Biden did right after the fact. In the 2020 election, Joe Biden was on the ropes and he spent all his money in South Carolina. And that when he won the South Carolina primary, he just started walking away with it. And I was
Yeah.
so mad when that happened, at the time, because I'm like, people are going to think that I just stole that, but clearly he's reading my computer. It's kind of like Reagan taking credit for my Cold War victory. Um, it's crazy, but okay, so that's the smart play is to keep going with this universe. But every year on November 22nd, I am reminded that I am obsessed with the JFK assassination. I never was. I always thought seems a little shady, feels like there was probably a second shooter, but whatever. Okay, I'm out, not interested, don't want to have an argument about it. Until I moved to Dallas and I went to the grassy knoll. And there's something about just standing in the grassy knoll where you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. so so I've got a very strong outline for a JFK historic fiction book that will lead to three books that are related by the character and with a little bit of a through line, but that'll take you from the 60s to the 80s to the 90s. And I really want to do that, but that's pretty high risk, and it's a big departure from what I'm currently writing. So I don't
Okay.
know. I know I might just take the time to do the JFK book, call it a year just to work on the JFK book. And then, I might shop that to publishers, see if I can't get that trad published. Um, I might even start looking around, sniffing around for an agent while I have a treatment and not the actual book, and see if I can't
Yeah.
get a what do you call it?
Get some representation.
You're just such a writer, Alex. But yeah, to basically try to go trad on that one. Um, anyway, yeah, those three books just absolutely uh, have me in love. And so the third one is a book that I actually started in college. It was my first real attempt at getting it, and I learned a secret. And this is for me. I don't know about anybody else, but if you're aspiring to write and you spend a lot of time working on character background that's never actually going to make it into the story, my recommendation is to set that aside and start working on the story and then adding your character background as you go. Because I would spend more time if I'd spent the time writing that I spent trying to make my characters perfect. I could have finished the book,
Yeah.
within 6 months to a year. But instead, I just murdered myself trying to make sure that I had the most detailed and backstoried characters in the history of the world. I think character is important. I mean,
Sure.
when we wrote when we wrote Monroe Doctrine, my joke was James writes the plot so that my characters have something to talk about. I I love good characters. I am disappointed in my own character writing sometimes. Sometimes I think I'm great, but like you'll see it. I think if you read in Advanced Contact, I think the character development was a little bit better. No, you know what? It's pretty good in the second one too. Sometimes though, you're just like they're not going anywhere. What? Come on.
Yeah.
Or my big frightening moment is I have characters that are developing and growing, and am I going to make too sharp of a turn? Um,
Yeah.
and is it going to lose people? Are they going to say, "Wait a minute,
They would never do
Lance
that.
Corporal Oliver would never do that"? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, come on, give me a
Yeah.
break.
So before I let you go, let's Pursuit by Fire comes out this summer. Where can people go to find more about you, follow that, and kind of get in and get ready for the big release?
Well, the biggest place is probably Twitter. I'm Alex Aaronson 80 on Twitter, and if you go to Twitter and you just search the word war porn, all one word, we actually are developing kind of a community of military writers on Twitter where we kind of help each other out. We have the largest group of Cold War turns hot alternate fiction, alternate history authors. There's like got to be 5 or 6 of us who've all published at least one. Um, so yeah, Twitter is a good place. If you look me up on Facebook, I just Alex Aaronson. There's my goofy face. There's a Soviet Endgame members group on Facebook as well, where we do a lot of discussion and hashing out. We literally just did a poll yesterday. Said, guys, I need a non-racial derogatory term for North Koreans, and so that was pretty fun. We're we're kind of stuck between Norks and Ricos, and it's been a fun discussion.
Well, Alex,
Um,
it was a pleasure, man. Thank you so much for coming on. Thanks for an invite to the war porn group there on Twitter today. And man, I wish you the best of luck. And I'm looking forward to diving into more of your work and hearing about this alternate fiction type of stuff you have going on. Especially if you start getting into the 2000s, man. Call me hooked because I want to see
right?
what you do with that.
You're killing me. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be on, man. I've had a blast. This is
Yes,
this
sir.
has been. I can't believe it's been an hour.
Yeah.
The viewers are like, "Oh, it's been an hour, Alex. You won't shut up."
All right. Well, thanks, man. I appreciate you coming on, and we'll stay in touch.